Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we'll be talking about the 2022 Senate election in Florida and whether it's actually in play. So, the reason that this is relevant now is because the Democratic candidate, Val Demings, has been catching up to a Republican incumbent, Marco Rubio, in the polls, and the race has, gotten a bit more attention as of late because it is, becoming a lot closer. So, originally, Rubio was up by 8.2% in the 538 average. That was in August. It then tightened to again, about a 2.7% lead, and it kind of stayed the same. We had a bit of a dip here where it was back to 4, but it narrowed back down to a 3.3% lead for Marco Rubio, and he's never, he hasn't really been at 50% at any point, and Demings has gone from, the 30s to the mid 40s, really, and she has really been surging in the polls as of late, whereas Rubio's been pretty stagnant, and, you can call it Demings, getting the more moderate Democrats on board, or, her gaining a little bit with pro-choice voters, but I think what it is that the polls in Florida are making the same mistake they made in 2020. And I know that might be disappointing for some Democrats to hear because, Marco Rubio is, in theory, an incumbent that they could potentially be able to knock off, but it's very unlikely to happen. And I'll talk about that right here. So if you look at the 2020 presidential election in Florida, it was, the polls weren't really that good. And I say this because Biden had the lead for basically like the entire campaign season, and he the closest really got to relinquishing it was just a 1.5% lead back in September of 2020. But really, he was always ahead, and we had a lot of polls that had him winning it by over 5%. When really it was never going to happen. And so on election day, he was up by 2.5. He lost by 3.3, which again is a 5.8% polling error towards Donald Trump. So in theory, like if you think that same polling error is going to happen again, Rubio would have to be down by 6% for Demings to be favored, and even then, it'd be well within the margin of error. And so, if you take a look at the final polls in 2020, Trump had a bit of momentum again. Listener group had him up by 4 instead of advantage, which again is the poll that surveyed this race. We'll talk about that in a second. They had Trump up by 1. Trafalgar had Trump up by 2. But again, when you look at the average, Biden was still up by 2.5, and these other polls he was ahead in Swayable, SurveyMonkey, AYTM, Change Research, Quinnipiac, and most, I think, infamously, he was leading the public policy polling, which again is a Democratic-leaning pollster, but they had him up by 7 points. And if you look at the polls that we got from St. Pete's polls here, I don't know exactly when it was, but St. Pete's at one point had Biden up by double digits in Florida. So we had a lot of polling data in Florida that showed it to be very, very close, or for Trump, but Biden was ahead by a ton in his polls, and so ultimately what we got was an average in which Donald Trump was doing very, very poorly, and he was behind by 2.5 on election day despite winning it by over 3. So, look, we can talk about the polls in Florida in 2022 because I don't want to just dismiss the polls outright, just because they were bad in 2020. And I think that this is again worth talking about because like I said, Florida is a state that could in theory be competitive. That doesn't mean I think it's going to be competitive, but it could in theory. And so let's just talk about the polls. So the poll we got yesterday, which is most recent, showed, which again from Insider Advantage, which is a Republican poll. So that's like the interesting part of this, that a Republican poll is showing it pretty tight. Rubio only beating Demings by 2%. And again, this is significant because Rubio, as an incumbent, is only at 46%. And he's someone who's been pretty well known in Florida in the past, and he's won big. In 2010, 2016, he won by a lot both times. He's been a good incumbent. But, the polls showed it pretty close. Susquehanna, which again, more Republican-leaning pollster, Rubio up by 3. For Bijon Lee, which is Donald Trump's pollster, showed it within 2. Again, and these are two Democratic internals, showed a 1.3 point Rubio lead, so fairly close. Center Street PAC, which has been inconsistent. They've had like Tim Ryan winning Ohio, but Rubio winning Florida by like 11. So not a huge fan of that. But yeah, I mean, I guess you can factor it in. University of North Florida had Demings up by 4, which again doesn't make a ton of sense to me, but I guess what they have. These are two Democratic Commission polls, both showing even races. And prior to that, back in July, Rubio's ahead in every poll, and even this Republican poll here, or this Democratic poll here, had Rubio up by 6. But since then, Democratic polls showed it close or narrow Rubio leads, and even now we have a poll that showed Val Demings ahead. So again, the polls have been tightening as of late. We've gotten data that's been showing Demings gaining ground in both fundraising, momentum, and obviously the polls. But I think it's important to remember what Florida actually looks like as a state, because you can look up at you can look at the polls, you can talk about the polls, but what matters the most is how the state's going to vote. And the Democrats have like a big problem in Florida. And so if you look at the 2020 map, and you compare it to the 2016 election here from 2016, it's pretty mixed. But let's just cut out this bottom part of your screen, right? Not literally. Don't break whatever device you're watching this on, but just pretend that that South Florida doesn't exist for a second. Don't worry, we'll get to it. Biden actually did pretty well in the Panhandle. Again, Escambia, which is home of Pensacola, he did 5% better there. Duval County, which is home of Jacksonville, he flipped it and he did 5% better there. He did better than Clinton and Pinellas. He flipped Pinellas. He did a little bit better than her in Hillsborough. He also flipped Seminole, which is one of the counties north of Orlando. And overall, he did pretty well in these kind of ex-urban, suburban counties. But the big problem for him is that he got some shifts in St. John's, Clay, and Duval. But unfortunately for Biden, he got smoked in Miami. He didn't get he won it, but he got his numbers in Miami-Dade were atrocious. Henry County again, smaller but pretty bad. And he also saw shifts against him in Palm Beach and in Broward County. And that's a big problem because Palm Beach and Broward and Miami-Dade are all very Democratic-leaning counties that Democrats rely on for a lot of votes. Again, Biden, this is a county that cast, almost 800,000 votes. Palm Beach, Broward cast nearly 1 million votes. Miami-Dade cast well over 1 million votes. And Democrats lost ground there. And, look, you can make gains in Jacksonville or in Tampa or in North Orlando or in Pensacola or in all these other cities. What matters the most is holding on to what you're doing in Miami. And Biden literally, Trump literally netted hundreds of thousands of votes from Miami-Dade County relative to 2016. That's why he won Florida. If you give Biden the Hillary Clinton numbers and the votes that she netted out of South Florida from 2016, Biden would have I think he would have either won Florida or would have been within 0.5%. So it would have been very close either way. And, things would have been much, much different because, again, you wouldn't have this massive talk of red Miami-Dade County. And again, Miami-Dade County, like I said, is a big county. It's the biggest county in Florida by population, and it cast the most votes in Florida elections because of how big it is. And, it was a Clinton plus 29, Biden plus 7 county that ultimately people are talking about could flip in the Senate race because Marco Rubio in 2016, he outran Trump by 10% in Miami-Dade. So if he outruns Trump by 10% again, he could win Miami-Dade County by a couple of points, which again would be absurd because Miami-Dade was, in the past thought of as a big bastion of Democratic votes in the state. So I do think this is I think the big problem for Democrats. I think Demi can do decently well in Jacksonville. I don't think she'll win Duval, but she can do decently well in Jacksonville. I think she'll hold on to to some ground in Tampa. I think she'll lose Pinellas County by a couple of points, but Hillsborough I think is a pure toss-up. I can see her holding on to it maybe by a point or so, but I do think she'll do well in the city of Tampa itself. I think Orlando's going to be her brightest spot because of where she's from, and again, Rubio didn't really, he did well in Orlando in 2016, but didn't do amazingly well, or he didn't overperform by as much as he did in other parts of the state. And then finally, I think Demings is going to do okay with margins in the college towns in Alachua County and in Palm Beach. Again, I do think she'll hold on to Palm Beach, though will narrow, as will Broward. But Miami-Dade is the big question here for Democrats, and Demings has to win it by at least 20 to have a plausible chance of victory here. And the thing is, I think she's favored to lose Miami-Dade. It literally it trended 22% to the left between 2016 and or to the right between 2016 and 2020, and it's a county that Rubio actually outran Trump by in 2016. Rubio, having a competent Republican Party backing him, being Hispanic himself, being someone who's has appeal to these communities even more than Donald Trump, who did very well there in 2020. I think it's going to be a red leading county. I wouldn't be stunned if Demings holds on to it, but again, I think 2022 is the year we see Miami-Dade flip for the first time in a while, and that that isn't to say that I think that 2022 will be this massive red wave where everything flips red, but it's certainly. It is very certainly to me a year I think Florida's going to be pretty red. So my take is that look you can look at these polls and they're interesting to see, and I'm glad that we're getting more polls because polls are always good, right? But when you're down by 2% in one poll, it doesn't mean you're necessarily competitive. And the thing we have to remember is that in all of Demings' good polls, they've been very, very sketchy. This one from Fabrizio Lee only had 500 likely voters. If you look at this one, these are two Democratic internals. You look at the Demings +4 poll. It had a good amount of likely voters. It was from a decent poll, but again, this is a poll that has been wrong in the past. So, they have a decent grade, but not necessarily sure I'd trust them on that. These two are Democratic internals, and everything else shows Rubio lead. So I'm not one to cherry pick polls. I'm not one to say Rubio is going to win by 15%, the way some people are expecting, but I do think he has a sizable advantage as of right now, and I'd be very, very surprised if Val Demings can win this race. In fact, if she wins, I will legit that will be the biggest upset I think in politics, even more so than Susan Collins winning, or even more so than Trump in 2016 or Johnson in 2016 or Hogan in 2014. All the upsets of politics in the past decade. I think Demings would take the cake for the biggest upset. So yeah, that's it. If you want to get my ballpark margin, I think Rubio wins by 9-10 when it's all said and done. I think he'll gain the polls. I think he'll be at 50% by election day. But again, um, these things are always very hard to predict, and I think it could be a little closer. But yeah, that being said, still gonna go Republican. And again, people should stop trusting polls just because that's what they want them to say. So thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you all next one. Bye, guys.